For the last 3 years or so, I have been researching the history, beliefs, and practices of the Heaven's Gate cult from the past up to the present. And when I tell people that, there's usually a few, well, there's a lot of questions, but a few that usually take the blue ribbon as far as like the most common ones I get asked. Sometimes it's, wait a minute, you're telling me there are still people who believe in Heaven's Gate? What's up with that? And then that's a whole thing. Sometimes people will ask, I've heard of Heaven's Gate, but, I actually don't really know much about them. What exactly did they believe? Which I always find interesting. I get a lot of those questions, even from people who have seen documentaries about them and listened to podcasts about them, which maybe should tell you something. But the other most common question that I get asked actually has very little to do with Heaven's Gate itself, and is instead the question of how exactly did you get into researching this topic, or why did you get into researching this topic in the first place? It's actually one of the hardest questions, I think, for me to answer. One of the reasons being, I think that there are actually probably a lot of answers I could give, especially to the latter question. What exactly draws me to this topic? I think the same is true for anyone that's drawn to this topic, or really anyone who's drawn to any topic that involves studying a belief system that may not necessarily align with their own. There's usually a lot of things that bring us to those research interests, and we may not even always be aware ourselves what all of those reasons are all the time. I know for me, it's only really very recently that I've really tried to, think really carefully about what drew me to this topic in the first place and what has sustained my interest over time. Another reason that question is hard to answer is because that changes. That's changed. If you asked me in my first year, what's keeping this going, my answer would have been one thing. You asked me a few months ago, my answer would be very different. I have for quite a long time wanted to, really sit down and try to give at least some kind of an answer to at least one of those questions. And I think the one that's a little bit more manageable, at least for me at this point, would be the first question of how exactly I even got into this topic in the first place. So I guess I would just start out by saying that this all began around 3.5 years ago in the fall of 2022. At the time, I was still in college. I was just wrapping up a bachelor's degree in philosophy. That might clue you into at least some of the reasons that I got interested in this topic. Or perhaps it only raises more questions. I was writing something. It wasn't for school, but it was kind of a reflective piece. I had started noticing that I was having difficulty having conversations even with other people that were studying philosophy, whether in a formal setting like school, or people that were more of the like autodidactic variety. Not that the two are necessarily mutually exclusive, but just having a hard time communicating with other people. And I think a lot about communication, and in particular communicating philosophical ideas, because I've been doing YouTube videos about philosophy and other related topics for longer than I've been interested in Heaven's Gate. I started this channel in early 2021. So I was wrapping up my philosophy degree, and I had been running this YouTube channel for almost 2 years before I really ever had much of an interest in studying Heaven's Gate. And I was writing this piece where I was trying to really try and find a solution to this question of what exactly does it take for people to have meaningful discourse with one another. And I guess I started thinking that I wonder if a lot of it has to do with having shared experiences, maybe shared values. To have a meaningful conversation with someone, you have to have a shared language. But a lot of what makes a language shared by people is the experiences that the language kind of grows out of. Think about like an inside joke that you might have with people that other people don't understand, that sort of thing. And believe it or not, I actually started to look at Heaven's Gate as possibly a really good example of a group of people that had figured out a way to make sense of the world, and were able to sustain this community, really in a lot of ways around this shared language. I was interested in the moments where the bodies were discovered and what it must have been like walking through this house with all of this rich symbolism
Hmm.
that is so elaborate and so like deep with some kind of meaning, but the
Yeah.
whole house is completely silent. So it's like even from the grave, like the way the bodies were organized, the shrouds, the costumes, the iconography, and
Yeah.
all the material they left behind for people to see, it's like these people were still communicating, and I felt like they were communicating better from beyond the grave with the rest of the world than I was communicating with fellow philosophers. I was very, very interested in the idea of how language could bring people together, could help people to unite around a shared goal. Even if it was a really unusual goal, not exactly the sort of goal I would want, myself or other people to be striving towards necessarily. But I was interested in, the methods, the methodology maybe behind how they had managed to achieve something that a lot of groups struggle to. A lot of groups struggle to achieve what Heaven's Gate did, getting a bunch of people from different backgrounds to live and work together on one thing for like 20 years. It is impressive. So I was really taken in by the language that Heaven's Gate used. And actually, one piece of their vernacular stood out to me, which was their penchant for referring to their bodies as vehicles. Now, the reason that this stood out to me is because it wasn't the first time I'd heard that kind of analogy. I had heard that exact analogy used by a guy that I had at one time in my life really, really liked, listened to almost every day for a few years, and that was the American yogi Ram Dass, formerly Richard Alpert.
It was like you looked through the veil and you saw something at work that was so vast and so almost impersonal, or so, the compassion was such horrible compassion. And for us to be able to live in that world where our hearts are breaking because from a human point of view, the suffering is unbearable, though you can bear it. And you can bear it because you are balanced with that other level of awareness which understands that it is as it is. And I'll tell you, from where I'm looking, there are no errors in the game.
On many occasions, I had heard tapes of him comparing death to being basically nothing more than something akin to dropping your car off at the auto shop. He would use the phrase I'm just dropping the body off. It's not a big deal. And so hearing this exact same analogy used by this group, this Heaven's Gate group, presumably to the end of helping them to really enforce that idea that like they were not their bodies, and that therefore when it came time for them to leave those bodies behind, they really weren't leaving behind anything of much value. And then thinking back to these many years I had spent listening to Ram Dass, which were very positive experiences, certainly did not lead me, or as far as I know, anyone else, to do anything like what Heaven's Gate did. That really interested me. How you could have two very similar metaphysical views. In particular, views about the body and the soul, and what death, is or isn't. Yet taking those metaphysical starting points to some very, very different conclusions. I wanted to know, why that was. That terminology in particular really interested me. But broadly speaking, just the very idea of them creating this, really shaping their world through reshaping their language, shaping the way they spoke and the way they thought about various things. it just really interested me. Maybe on some level, I was wondering if maybe there was something more constructive and more positive that we might be able to glean from understanding the mechanisms of their community that they had developed for themselves.